And Ms. Lee, page 21, beginning on
I ask that the
line.
amendment be considered as read.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I have an amendment that I'm offering with Ms. Lee. And before I talk about it, I would also like to ask that unanimous consent to submit several letters from religious and nonprofit organizations in support of the amendment to the record.
Considered done. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, as a Jewish member of Congress who is proud to represent Florida's vibrant and really diverse 23rd Congressional District, I offer this amendment with Ms. Lee to strike Section 116 of the bill, as it would undercut the values of our nation's religious organizations, violate our First Amendment rights, and harm our constituents. Section 116, which my amendment strikes, would water down a provision in the tax code, sometimes referred to as the Johnson Amendment, which protects the integrity and independence of charities and houses of worship by ensuring they do not endorse or oppose political candidates. Current law reflects the importance of this independence by striking a careful balance. Houses of worship with tax-exempt status are permitted to engage in political advocacy. They just can't tell people who to vote for. So it's no surprise that hundreds of religious organizations and faith leaders oppose Section 116 of this legislation out of an understandable concern that political parties and candidates seeking power would be empowered to use their congregations as tools and pressure them for endorsements. Make no mistake, weakening existing law could have the unintended consequence of dividing congregations and opening them up to political wheeling and dealing. If there's one thing I know for sure, it's that Americans do not want more partisanship, and they certainly don't want it in their most sacred places. Under current law, houses of worship can engage in the activities that we would want them to engage in: public debates on any issue, candidate forums, voter registration drives, getting out the vote, helping to transport people to the polls, and even within reason, lobbying on specific legislation. They just can't endorse or oppose specific candidates or use their tax-exempt donations to contribute to candidates' campaigns. It's that simple. As if gutting these protections for houses of worship weren't bad enough, this provision also likely violates our First Amendment rights. While current law applies to all tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, Section 116 would only apply to churches. Specifically, Section 116 makes it nearly impossible for the IRS to investigate claims that churches, but only churches, have violated the law. Other nonprofits would be treated differently. The Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was designed to prevent exactly this kind of religious favoritism. Regardless of our political stripes and colors, no one wants our charities or houses of worship to be torn apart by partisan campaign politics, and no one wants their First Amendment rights ripped away from them. As people of faith, we cannot allow this effort to politicize our sanctuaries of worship to move forward. And as federal lawmakers, we have a responsibility to ensure equal justice, liberty, and protection for all people. For 60 years, and if not longer, we have prevented and really allowed for the sanctity of our houses of worship to be maintained. We have said very strongly in the law that houses of worship cannot endorse political candidates, and they cannot make contributions from their nonprofit charitable funds to candidates or political parties. That prohibition should remain, and the sanctity of our houses of worship should be preserved. I urge the members' adoption of the amendment and yield back the
I thank the gentlewoman for her comments. Chairman Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll certainly allow Mr. Culberson to address this, but I rise in opposition to the amendment. This is the way we have this language drafted in the bill, supported by the Ways and Means Committee, the authorizing committee, which has jurisdiction over this. And in no way does this language allow for nonprofits to engage in political activity. This language that we have in here actually protects nonprofits from the IRS and over abuse. So let's make sure we're clear on what our language does and what is attempted to be repealed. With that, I urge a no vote, and I'm sure we'll hear from Mr. Culberson.
Chairman Graves. Mr. Quigley.
I rise in support of the amendment. Polling consistently shows that large majorities, 70 or 80%, depending on the survey, oppose candidate endorsements in churches. Just when the clergy are asked, the numbers are more like 90%, including among evangelical pastors. While the prohibition on electioneering by charities is seldom enforced, this policy writer seeks to intimidate the IRS to keep it from enforcing tax law and invites individuals to use churches to circumvent campaign finance rules. The prohibition has allowed charitable organizations to concentrate on their exempt purposes and not to be distracted or co-opted by partisan campaigns. Without it, houses of worship would be exposed to political pressure to endorse candidates. Nothing in the tax law prevents pastors from speaking out from the pulpit on issues, no matter how controversial. Although the current law applies to all tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, Section 116 would apply only to houses of worship. By giving houses of worship special treatment in the enforcement of IRS restrictions on intervention in political campaigns, the amendment raises serious concerns under the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and undermines religious freedom.
Thank you, Mr. Quigley. Pleased to recognize the co-sponsor of the amendment, Ms. Lee, for any remarks she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz for this amendment. I'm proud to co-sponsor it with her and associate myself with her remarks. As she mentioned, Section 116 in this bill is really designed to give religious organizations in violation of the First Amendment special tax benefits and privileges that are unavailable to other non-religious organizations. This is truly a slippery slope. Sadly, this provision would make it very difficult for the IRS to investigate churches if they are in violation of the law. Now, as a person of faith, and as one who is a firm believer of the separation of church and state, I can attest that I do not want to worship in a place in my church that could become overly politicized. And other Americans agree. As our ranking member mentioned, according to public opinion polling, more than 7 in 10 Americans oppose allowing churches and places of worship to endorse political candidates. Americans and our Constitution are on the right side of this issue. Our committee should follow suit and support this amendment. In order to protect the integrity and independence of churches and houses of worship and faith-based charities, we need to ensure that they do not endorse or oppose political candidates and become politicized. So I hope that my colleagues will support this important amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Mr. Culbertson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I would urge members to oppose this amendment. When you visit the Jefferson Memorial, written around the top of that monument to my favorite founder, when Mr. Jefferson often said that the law has no jurisdiction over the mind of man. We, in this Congress and in this country, have always cherished and protected the right of each one of us as free people to speak freely, to think freely. That's why the First Amendment is so clear that Congress can make no law respecting an establishment or religion, nor infringe on the freedom of the speech, freedom of thought, freedom of the press, freedom of the right of the people to peaceably assemble. And under President Johnson's administration, he must have gotten crossways with some church somewhere, because the IRS, at President Johnson's direction, issued a regulation. And again, this is a regulation issued by the IRS designed to squelch political speech from the pulpit. Now, why should ministers, whether they be in a synagogue or a church or any other place of worship, have their freedom of thought and speech suppressed? This is an IRS regulation that I hope the administration will overturn. But in the meantime, this language, which I asked Chairman Graves and the committee to include, and I appreciate, thank you very much for including this language, which is designed simply to make it much more difficult for the IRS to take away the tax-exempt status of a church, a synagogue, or a religious organization for involving themselves in some way, form, or fashion in a political campaign. And the reason it came to my attention is, frankly, it's offensive for the IRS to try to squelch the thought or political speech of a pastor or a minister. But I also represent the 2 largest churches in America. Proud to represent Lakewood Church and Second Baptist. And a number of years ago, Second Baptist simply handed out voter registration cards. And the people of the American Way sued them and attempted to revoke Second Baptist's tax-exempt status simply for handing out voter registration cards. Now, that's absurd. That's why I offer this amendment, and I appreciate you including it in the bill. And it's very simple. It'll just make it very difficult for the IRS commissioner to revoke the tax-exempt status of a church and make it a personal responsibility of the commissioner of the IRS to do so by reporting to the committees of jurisdiction in Congress. So I urge members to defeat the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Culbertson. Ms. Lowy, for any comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of this amendment. The bill before us would prohibit the IRS from enforcing the Johnson Amendment, which since 1954 has ensured that the 501c3 charities and religious organizations do not use their tax-exempt status for political purposes. And yet, without authorization, this is an Appropriations Committee, this bill would block the IRS from upholding the law. The Johnson Amendment exists to protect the integrity of nonprofits, including houses of worship, not to weaken their influence. Many fear what would come of religious entities should they suddenly be inundated with political pressures to fund and endorse candidates. This would open the door to disclosure, loopholes, should major contributors attempt to funnel funds through houses of worship. The Johnson Amendment does not prevent houses of worship from speaking out about any political or social issue that they are passionate about, that they hold dear. This should be clear to all of us, from churches, synagogues, mosques in our district that engage in social justice movements and voice their well-regarded opinions to us regularly. Section 116 of this bill is especially problematic from a constitutional perspective, although current law applies to all tax-exempt organizations. This section only applies to houses of worship, giving them special treatment. This raises both Establishment Clause and First Amendment concern. My colleagues, Mr. Chairman, my friends, let us not use the appropriations process to continuously articulate the will of President Trump's tweeted campaign promises. Let's be the responsible adults in the room. And if we want to change it, if we want to change policy, go to the authorizing committees. Let's vote for the amendment, and thank you for introducing it.
Clark of Massachusetts recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment. The Johnson Amendment provides important protections by keeping our churches separate from our politics. Everyone in this country has a right to organize, advocate, and vote for any candidate that they please. This is the most fundamental right in our country, and no one wants to change that. But what is proposed here is something different. Do we really want to use our places of worship as a pass-through for political donations and corresponding tax breaks? I don't believe that we do. The Johnson Amendment is common sense, and to get rid of it now would have dire consequences for our democracy. I urge support of this amendment and yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Ms. McCollum's recognized.
Mr. Chair, I rise in support of this amendment, which maintains America's tradition of separation between church and state. And I'm proud to stand with a broad coalition of religious leaders, organizations, faith leaders, nonprofits, civil rights organizations, and the vast majority of American people who support the current law, which this amendment upholds. I want to simply read here a letter, a portion of it, from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. They say any weakening of the prohibition would put tremendous pressure on nonprofits, including churches, to support or oppose candidates. Let me read from them directly. Politicizing the sector will hurt our ability to deliver our missions. We have had reliable refuge to escape toxic partisanship organizations, and we are able to operate as safe places where people can come together and actually solve community problems rather than just posture and remain torn apart. They oppose changing the Johnson Amendment because they think this goes to the heart of what they can do, which is bring us together after elections and heal America. With that, I yield back.
Ms. McCollum, Mr. Price is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I I suggest that we all consult our common sense and our common experience on this matter before we take the step to bring partisan, candidate-centered politics into our churches. That's really what's at stake here, not the ability of churches to advocate, churches, synagogues, mosques, religious institutions to advocate on the issues of the day, and not an ability to encourage voting, indeed to organize souls to the polls, as churches often do, or to encourage voter registration. I've never, until tonight, heard about churches and synagogues being forbidden to conduct that activity. You know, as long as this is in promotion, as long as the activity is in promotion of good citizenship, conscientious citizenship, the relationship of our faith traditions and morality to politics and to the issues of the day, we want to encourage more activity, not less. And there's plenty of evidence in our recent history that that kind of advocacy, that kind of citizenship and concern for the common good is alive and well in our religious institutions. What we do not want, though, is to legitimate using religious institutions as simply a conduit for political contributions or for candidate and party-centered political advocacy. That would be a huge step backward, and it would lead, I think, to great cynicism about the activities of these institutions. At present, they're greatly respected. They have great moral force. People pay attention. If it's simply seen, though, as an extension of campaigns or institutions that are exploited by campaigns, I think that removes that moral force and makes this something that that we live to regret. So let's just think about this. I doubt that any of us have experiences that match some of the worst case scenarios that we hear from the religious right. I just don't think it happens. So therefore, let's not act on the basis of some kind of hysterical charges. Let's maintain the safeguards that are in place and that have served us well.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Wasserman Schultz to close, or Ms. Pingree is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to yield my time back to Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Absolutely. Please remain standing. Ms. Wasserman Schultz is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady and the chairman. I would just suggest that every member, before you decide how you're going to vote on this, take a look at page 21 of the bill. Line 24 is where section 116 begins, and I want to read it to you. It's not very long, but I want everyone to understand what we are trying to strike from this legislation, that if we do not take it out of this legislation, would be allowed. None of the funds made available by this act may be used by the Internal Revenue Service to make a determination that a church, an integrated auxiliary of a church, or a convention or association of churches is not exempt from taxation for participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office unless the Commissioner of Internal Revenue consents to such determination. Not later than 30 days after such determination, the Commissioner notifies the Committee on Ways and Means of the House of Representatives and the Committee on Finance of the Senate of such determination. And such determination is effective with respect to the church, integrated auxiliary of a church, or convention or association of churches not earlier than 90 days after the date of the notification under the paragraph. If that sounds complicated, it is obviously designed to be intentionally so. And it expressly authorizes only churches to endorse or oppose candidates. This is going to be a be careful what you wish for moment for everyone here. Because I'd like everybody to think about whether or not they have primary opposition or may one day have primary opposition and be on the wrong end of a church's endorsement. Is that really where we want to go? We really want to ask our houses of worship or thrust them in the midst of political battles for and against candidates, these are nonprofit organizations, and they are religious nonprofit organizations specifically. So we're going to take only churches, and we're going to create a very cumbersome process to have an investigation of their wrongdoing if they violate the law. And we're going to leave every other nonprofit and treat them differently and make it easier. That does not make sense. It's not fair. It's likely unconstitutional, and it violates the First Amendment. But it particularly violates the sanctity that worshipers expect and have the right to continue to expect, that they, when they attend their houses of worship, will not be thrust in the midst of partisan politics, which is currently prohibited. So I would urge members to vote in favor of my amendment to make sure that we can preserve 60 years of good law that protects the integrity of our houses of worship and of the idea that nonprofit organizations, religious or otherwise, should not be expressly supporting or opposing candidates or contributing their nonprofit charitable resources to political parties. Specifically, we need to make sure that we protect the people who are attending these houses of worship. I yield back the balance of my time, and I do not need the additional minute.
One of our colleagues,
Would the gentlelady yield me the
would
Yes,
would you yield your last minute? to
Yes, I'd be happy to
Ms.
yield.
Kaptur?
Yes,
I
I'd be happy to
have
yield.
a-
Well, actually, it's the gentlelady's time.
I believe your time is up, Ms. Pingree, but if the minute to Ms. Kaptur.
I just wanted to ask the majority, the bill reads church. Does your definition of church, Mr. Culbertson, Mr. Gray, does that include synagogues? Does it include mosques? Does it include houses of assembly? Does it include Baha'i gathering places? What does church mean?
If through the chair, if you wish to address the issue, though it could be.
The IRS rule, this is aimed
Mr.
at the
Culbertson.
IRS, this is aimed at the Johnson rule, which covers all religious organizations.
But that isn't what this says. This doesn't quote the Johnson rule directly. I honestly, I think
This was written with the Ways and Means Committee staff very carefully, so we don't infringe on their jurisdiction. This is approved by the authorizers and is narrowly aimed at the Johnson Amendment, which covers all religious organizations.
I thank you for that, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and
Thank you, Ms.
Ms.
Kaptur.
Pingree for yielding, but honestly, this is not the jurisdiction of the Appropriations Committee, my friends.
Thank you.
This shouldn't even be in the bill.
Thank you, Ms. Kaptur. Question is on the gentlewoman from Florida's amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. No. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. A show of hands,